Bum 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 bum. That's right, we're talking about it. Pandemic, Star Wars: The Clone Wars, the reiteration, this year's version of it. Is it worth it? Do you need it? Pros, cons, a little bit of everything else in between, because, I do love me some good Pandemic. Where does this fall? And why should you pick this one up? Let's talk. So you all know the Pandemic system by now, right? Cooperative, this is 1 to 4 players, and you are going up as Jedi against, the dark side, essentially. Not just the Sith, the dark side as a whole. Ventress, Dooku, Maul, as well as the ever-loving Bladed Grievous. How do you feel about that? How do you think it's going to stack up? Does it stack up to the other Pandemics? Because the issue with the past couple is they've kind of been meh, Fall of Rome, it's okay. Call of Cthulhu, or whatever that one was, it's okay. The rapid ones, okay. But, is this just Star Wars slapped on the box and reskinned? Because, frankly speaking, that's not really appealing. I don't need to see popular IPs slapped on to mediocre games. That's not what I want in my collection. And let me tell you right now, this is better than that. How good is it, though? It's going to be depending on your mileage, and it may vary. And let's talk about why that is. So the basic gist of this game is very much similar to Pandemic, if you want to start there, right? You either move your Jedi around, you attack droids or your enemy that's on the same planet as you are, you try and attempt a mission using the cards that you have in your hand, which are not lost, which we'll talk about in a second, or you draw a card. Those are your 4 basic actions. You have outbreak cards, which are essentially invade cards, each within a villain's unique 6-card deck that you're going to be drawing one at a time after your Jedi's turn, and those are going to do various things on the board, and the invade cards themselves are going to populate new planets. They're going to cause what we would consider outbreaks in these situations. They're going to raise the invade level, which is how many planet cards you're drawing to populate each turn, and then they're also going to increase the threat level through various means. And if the threat level gets too high, you run out of droids. Those are the 2 things that are going to potentially end the game. So with that overview, let's go into the nuts and bolts of things. Let's be very frank. This is an overproduced game. Like a lot of these games, this Z-Man game, I think of comparison right off the bat, Z-Man, the previous iteration, my favorite iteration of Pandemic, Iberia, right? It's all cubes. I love Iberia. Iberia, for me, is the gold standard of Pandemics. I don't care what you say about Legacy 1, Legacy 2, Legacy 0. It's the gold standard of difficulty, incorporation of theme, as well as variability without having to have a whole lot of stuff to make it a whole lot different every single time. And it's also really, 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 really well balanced in terms of, well, I want to be this guy this time. I'm going to be this guy this time. Now, I will say it's a little bit easier at higher player counts, but that's a whole nother matter. I mean, it takes things like the rails. It gives you different ways of, customizing the game with the different rule sets to make it a little bit harder if Pandemic is too easy for you, which, I mean, it's not. Pandemic's actually, Iberia is one of the harder ones. Anyway, but this is the basic gist of, okay, is it better than just the skin that's on it? And it's a little bit off-putting when you open the game at first. I mean, this box could probably be, frankly speaking, half the size, because half of it is literally just the miniatures taking up of these little tiny skinny Jedi with the most fragile looking plastic lightsabers. I mean, I kid you not. The board itself is a little bit oversized. I mean, it works. It takes the problem of the Cthulhu Death May Die, where you have too many big guys sitting on small areas. And you've got plenty of big-sized planets here, so that's not as much of an issue here. Even if you've got 3 droids, 2 Jedi, a boss, and a battleship all in one area, it still is relatively, succinct. But it's still a little bit larger of a table slice hog than I would like. But, you've got these sets of miniatures right here, and I'll pick it up here so you can see it here, but I'll show you more blown-up pictures over my face. These are incredibly delicate. These are a little flimsy, too. And so the lightsabers are a nice touch, but because of that, you can see that right here, it's taking up over half of the insert. And the rest of this bottom of this insert, you can take out, because this whole corner right here is empty space. And I left it in there so you could hear this because it's totally unnecessary. And so you slight down the board a little bit, and then you actually would be able to buy a smaller box. If these were more cube-ish,
or just, I feel like it would be better if it was more villainous, right? The villainous tokens as the Jedi. That would be really cool. But you're not here to talk about components, right? You want to know, does the gameplay stack up? And it does, kind of. And let me explain, because again, I am a huge Star Wars fan, right? And so I'm trying to go into this as someone who, like, if this didn't have Star Wars on it, would I like it as much? And the honest answer is always no. But because it has the IP, it's going to notch it up a half degree of whatever you like in that sort of sense. So if you don't have an attachment to the Star Wars IP, it'd be a little bit easier to evaluate this separately. But some of the cool things that I like in this game, the incorporations of some of this, right? Because the problem with Pandemic always is, just like with Spirit Island, right? When you win by fear, it's sort of anticlimactic. And so with that, you've got these bad guy cards of the 4 ones I mentioned, right? And after you complete a certain number of missions, then you go flip and you get the ultimate end victory thing, which is completely different. And it's hard, and it's, somewhere else potentially, and it's going to be changing the dynamic of the game as, relatively significantly. I think the one detriment I would say is, well, there's only these 4. Like, I hate saying this. I mean, it's ripe for expansions, but at the same time, you pick the Clone Wars where you've kind of only got 4 bad guys to choose from. Really? Like, maybe if you go a little bit off canon, you can have like Savage Opress, which is actually a card in here, but a few of those others, like the Dathomir, the Night Sisters, those sorts of things. And that would be nice, but I wish there were about 2 more villains in this, because I could see, after about a dozen plays, playing each of them 3 times, you could get a little bit of a sense of, okay, this is kind of samey. And that's the great thing about Iberia is you don't ever have that. At least I don't. Now, how do you mitigate that, though? I mean, because, like I mentioned, well, if you only have 4 bad guys, what about the good guys? Well, you have 7 good guys. You've got any combination of the Jedis and the Masters that you want, right? If you want to put Yoda with one of his pupils, you can have him with Obi-Wan. If you want to put Obi-Wan with one of his pupils, you can do that with Anakin. If you want Anakin with one of his pupils, you can put him with Ahsoka. So you can make those combinations of Jedi that you're familiar with from the show, the canon, the lore, whatever it may be, and that's kind of nice. The thing I'll say about the powers, because you get 4 actions just like the basic Pandemic, I guess I should start with this, and they're relatively straightforward, right? You move, you attack, you do a mission, or you draw a card. The biggest difference of this Pandemic, of everything else, right, is you don't discard your cards. Your cards are your damage, but your cards are also just your cards. You keep your cards. You have a card hand size of 7 cards, and as you use them, you don't play them, you don't discard them, you tap them. And as you tap them and exhaust them, you can not only have yourself doing that on your turn, but if you're on a planet, a mission with someone else, you can contribute to their mission, which is where the true sense of more cooperation on other people's turns comes in. And that is a big improvement compared to a lot of the other Pandemic games, where, like, with my mentioned previously comparison of Iberia, you can't really do a whole lot on other people's turns, right? It's, multiplayer solitaire in a sense. And I, don't get me wrong, I love me some multiplayer solitaire, but I also hate me some multiplayer solitaire at times. I like more interaction on other people's turns. It also keeps the boredom factor, especially for those of us at a higher player count, more engaged in what you're doing. And that in there lies with what the missions are, because the missions are going to be flipped up. And that is the best thing about this game, I will say, is that there is a thick stack of missions, a very thick stack of missions. And that's what's kind of nice, is because they all have, okay, well, you can only contribute one of these types of cards this time, or you can only do this when completed, or you're stuck there until you complete the mission, so you can't move off even if you fail. And so they all have little things like that to make the missions slightly more spicy, and that's a really good feature. I like this feature a lot, and it balances a little bit with the lack of higher variety of villains, if you will. The other nice thing, it's just a nice thing. It's a little bit of a dynamic Pandemic where you start, right? Well, you get your little player aid, and all the other player aids have specific starting plans on it. So as you're passing them out, they all look exactly the same. Then you flip them over and you find out where in the galaxy you're starting, which is a small nuance thing, but again, it's a nice touch. The cards themselves, again, it's a very, very large deck of cards that you're going to be going through. The planets, yeah, I mean, the planet sizes is almost the size of the regular deck cards. And the problem is there's just not enough spice of life in here, if you will, because allies, which are where all the cool, unique one-time abilities are. But in this like whole 46 card deck, there's only like, I don't know, like maybe 8 of them. And so your chances of getting them when you're drawing them one at a time for the most part is not very good. And so then you get purple, blue, yellow, red. And purples and reds are your attacks, which if you're attacking stuff, you can only deal one of them at a time. And you can use them together only when you're doing the missions, which again is a nice touch because otherwise it would be way too easy if you could just use every single attack card in your turn every single turn. The yellow, again, it's a way to mitigate tapping it to avoid damage. And damage is important because, well, you can't get knocked out because that's the issue with things where you have some health, right? Especially in a game like Pandemic, like you don't want to be knocked out of a game like this, right? And so not getting knocked out in just losing cards in your hand. I mean, cards in your hand are how you're going to be completing all of these missions. You're going to have enough damage. And if you have these missions that are spread out, it's a little bit harder to navigate that. And that's the thing I'll say is that at the higher player counts, you're going to be more spread out. You're going to have more availability to get to these missions because these missions don't scale per player count, right? And you only have 2 missions out no matter what. And so that's something that, especially at the higher player count, you're going to be able to more easily mitigate as well. Because again, like I said, you can cooperate if you are on the same planet with those missions on other people's turns. So you can go 2 and 2 if you're playing with 4, but if you're playing with 2, well, you've got one over here and one over here, or all of a sudden a new one pops up over here, and it's harder to get there. And after every turn, the bad guys are going, they're invading. And in this case, just like with the other pandemics, if you run out of battle droids, then that moves the threat, and the threat only goes up to 7, and the other enemies are going to be slowly moving up the threat as well. So there is not as much wiggle room, which is nice because the first time I played it with the starting villain, and again, if you're getting into it, Ventress is the starting villain. She's not very hard. It reminds me very much of Marvel United in the sense that the villains that were in the original Marvel United that went to retail were very underwhelming and very not representative of what that game could truly scale. And already going into the other 3 villains, they're going to be a much better experience for you as a whole, which is why I really wish there were more of them in there. 2 extra villains in this game would absolutely make this an absolute go out and get it. It's a great version of Pandemic. The 4, again, how often are you going to play this? How much do you want to play the same ones over and over again? Even though, these cards are not as different as I was like, but these cards right here are going to be, slightly much more, because that's the other thing I didn't mention is you only choose a certain number of these missions, right? It's not, okay, put all these out there. It's not randomly flip up, something bad when it happens and it's a timer. You choose the number of missions you want out of this whole deck, and then you put the rest of the deck aside. And then you play until you complete all the missions that you do, and then you go to that finale, the bad guy flip that I mentioned at the very beginning. And you can choose, depending on your difficulty, how many you want. And I think the regular difficulty is like anywhere between 3 to 6. But they say if you're really good, if you are one of those people, I see those people posting on Board Game Geek all the time, right? They're like, I have never lost Ghost Stories. I win Aeon's End with a 98% win ratio. Spirit Island is the easiest game in my collection. Well, then you can throw as many of these mission cards in there as you want to do to see how good you actually are. There's no limit to that either. But you only have 2 of them out on the board at the same time, which is why I say, okay, your mileage may vary because of the spread that I mentioned. This little thing right here is going to be probably one of the biggest make it or break it for you if nothing I've said before this is already. This is I believe, 12-sided die. And so on this 12-sided die, you have a corresponding number of symbols that have either positives or negatives, damage or successes. And you roll this at the beginning of every mission phase that you take as an action. And it has everything from a blank side to a side with 3 successes and 1 damage. And there's a few sides with just successes, and there's a few sides that are just equal in terms of damage and successes. And so that goes in to the factoring of the mission cards when you have these mission cards, which also potentially do a damage to you. So you can take multiple damage, which is, in this game, discarding cards. Your life bread. Not that having no cards is detrimental, but it's going to take you time to do because everything battling wise is the use of the cards. And I just played a game with Darth Maul being the villain. And I was Ahsoka, and I was on a mission. And I had 7 cards in my hand. I had 5 attack cards, 1 defense card, and 1 card that allowed me to get 2 automatic successes if I discarded it, right? And so the blessing in this game is that you roll the die before you commit the cards, because a lot of other games you commit cards and then you roll the die to see, right? So you kind of have to, hedge your bets, right? I'm looking at like Yggdrasil, for example, that cooperative game, if you're not familiar with that, where you have to commit and then roll and potentially not get. So you have to potentially overcommit, which is a harder tactic. It's a harder level of difficulty, if you will. I rolled the die. I kid you not. I needed, so if you counted that, right, I had 7 total success. I needed 9 on the mission I was doing. So I needed 2 on this die. It's about 50% to get it here on the die with 2 successes. I failed 4 times in a row on that mission. I sat turn by turn by turn on that mission. I drew a couple new cards, didn't get anything better, rolled this 4 times, failed every single time. And so that's where this is going to come in as, your lifesaver, or a thing that's just going to, dead of winter you when you roll the blank side. And if that's going to be something that you cannot stand in a game like this, that is going to basically shift it out of the Euro sense, or more Euro-y if you're looking for something like that, and more into the Amerith, whatever you want to call it, chaotic, more luck-based, this is something you need to know about, because that can happen. You can hedge your bets, but again, especially at the lower player counts, for 2 players, as I was playing with that, against 2 missions, I have 1 character over here and 1 character over here, and, I don't have the luxury of getting both characters over there so I can use them. And at the higher player counts, you will. At the lower player counts, this might be the make it or break it. So how do you feel about that? Right? Overall, what do I think of this game? Like I mentioned, needs a couple more villains. Your mileage may vary with the die. I wished for a couple extra different cards in this deck because, like I mentioned, all of the purples are add 1. All of the red are add 1 attack. All of the yellows tap to prevent 1 damage. All of the blues go an extra space on your move. That's it, right? That's 80 or 90% of the cards in here. So some slight variation of that, or some tweak, or some just twist would be a little bit nicer in here as an added degree of difficulty. But that's also where these come in. So take that for what you will. Is that something you're willing to have in terms of a trade-off? The other thing I mentioned is you have a bad guy deck, and the bad guy deck is only 6 cards. One of those is your quintessential, pandemic escalate everything card. Everyone has one of these Planet Under Siege cards. And so that's the real risk, is when you shuffle up these 6 cards, is that one going to land on top? Because then, populate, shuffle, and put them back on the stack and risk what was previously known as outbreak. In this case, blockade. Because if you run out of those blockade ships, which are only 3, again, that raises the threat level. The threat level gets to 7, you lose. And that can escalate things very quickly. So the degree of difficulty is not always as consistent, I would say, between games, just because you are going to be utilizing this. These are Mauls, for example. Card deck, and if you just get a bad shuffle a couple times, and it can go either way. Last aspect on the bad guys here, there are different effects on here. There's effects that are when they're on the board and effects when they're off the board. And so if you also pull the ones that say on board only, do this, and you've knocked out the villain, that's really, really good. And so it's really incentivizing you to knock out the villain as much as you can, but it's also sort of a diversion in terms of completing the missions in the first place. So it's an interesting dynamic that I wasn't expecting to like as much as I did. I'm relatively pleased with this game. I'm actually more pleased with it than I was expecting after the first play or 2. I'll say, though, I'm not sure it's going to replace Iberia. I mean, it's different enough with the missions and the way you're tapping the cards and using them and keeping them, as opposed to, discarding them when you've used them and drawing more, that I feel like they are two separate games, and I would be happy to have both of these in my collection. Do you need this one in the Cthulhu one? Do you need this one in Fall of Rome? That might be a little bit more of a toss-up, but I have no problem with Iberia and this one both staying in my collection. So like I mentioned earlier in the video, pros, cons, everything in between. I've covered everything else that I can talk about within the game. Where do things stand? Ultimately, like I said, I wish that this Star Wars game had just been Star Wars instead of Star Wars The Clone Wars, because it would be so much more right for canon. Ultimately, I wish it was more Star Wars instead of Star Wars The Clone Wars. I mean, it's cool, but I think you sort of backed yourself into the corner there, because this is the one game that I could really look at from a pandemic standpoint and say, you know what? Give me a small expansion for $20 or $30 here. Throw in a couple more extra villains. Throw in a couple more Jedi. Throw in the Marvel United, to use that comparison again, advanced degrees of what Marvel United X-Men did for Marvel United, to give it just the step up, the notch that makes a relatively good game just, wow, you know, this is actually super solid in terms of some of that variability with the villains, in terms of just slight twists on the mechanics that are already present and incorporated well, but could be even incorporated to a further extent to make it just pop. An excellent game. Right? And that's the difference that we're talking here is this going to be a really good game, or is this going to be an excellent game? And sometimes really good games don't last in your collection, if you know what I mean. And that's the sort of thing that I go. Otherwise, you know, too lazy, didn't watch the rest of the video summary. The villains, Ventress does not give the overall impression of the game. Maul, but especially Dooku and Grievous, really notch things up, and they are really much more difficult, especially at the lower player counts. So if you want a challenge, they are fantastic from an individual standpoint. The uniqueness of flipping them over for the final finale sequence really makes it much less anticlimactic than most of the other games that have some sort of cooperative nature like this in the first place, and I really like that element of things. The Jedi, I'll say right now as a con, they really are, your mileage may vary. Yoda, for example, isn't terribly useful. I mean, Yoda allows other people to move for free, so he's great at higher player counts, but at lower player counts, not really as much whatsoever. It's a redundancy of one of the cards you have, essentially. So you know, as the Grandmaster of all Grandmaster Jedi, you know, give me something freaking awesome. The other ones are just more useful, especially at lower player counts, and that's slightly disappointing, even though the other ones, like Obi-Wan, for example, draw 4 cards for free, keep one of them, put the other 3 back on the bottom of the deck. Anakin, use basically anything as a red attack card, as a free action as well. So, I mean, there's some cool things there in addition. I like the fact that the missions are out there and you only have 2 missions, and the mission variability, again, is a huge pro. Huge. And I like the villains that can be attacked and knocked off the board but come back. And that's a really cool dynamic, because it forces you to choose. If the villain stays on the board, more bad things happen, but it also prevents me from using my limited actions that Pandemic is famous for going after the true objective of the actual game. So the more you do that, the less you do of the other. And how do you balance that? Because then they come back and they harass you again in different ways. And that's what also, like I mentioned, Maul, Dooku, and Grievous do a really good and really asymmetric job of capturing. So overall, this game, I'm very happy with what it has. It just, I sometimes feel like now, having played through it all multiple times, does it have enough to make me want to play it again on a repeated basis? Like, I mean, I look at Spirit Island, the base game. I look at The Loop, the base game. My 2 other, and even this thing right here, Cthulhu This May Die. The base games, all of those, I can play them ad nauseum and have a completely different experience without feeling it too much of the same. And so the uniqueness that these villains offer also makes it a little bit of the same at the same time, if you know what I'm saying there, in terms of the combination of those 2 elements. And so it's just one of those things, like I said earlier in the video, if you play this a dozen times, I know The Loop is going to give me a completely brand new experience, and the missions are going to be where the emphasis of the villain's slack sort of is picked up. And if you are okay with that, great. If you're not as much, I could see this falling a little bit flat with you. But the incorporation of the balance of that, as well with the cards that you're tapping instead of just playing and getting rid of, it really forces you to actually, especially at the higher player counts, try to not take as much damage, because you will have things that will take your damage, and then instead of being able to go for the mission in your next round, you're going to have to spend the whole turn replenishing your cards to be able to do anything else in the first place. So it's got some really cool elements that I feel like if just were a little bit more fulfilled out, this would again make it really like stand out excellent. Instead, I have to say it's really good, but I could see people, for like the reasons I mentioned, including things like the die rolling, miss a little bit too. So there you go. All my thoughts in a nutshell at the end here as well. So if you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, let me know down below. All of my playing was with those 5 missions within the base game alone, so I wasn't playing it the easiest. I didn't max it out, but I definitely pushed it to see what sort of scalability in terms of that mission requirement was to get a good sense. So that's another huge pro that I didn't mention earlier. That is just a nice feature to have. So questions, comments down below. Do the YouTube thing. Click, 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 click. If you like this, there's more of that, where it came from. I do this enough on the weekly basis. I have a Patreon, whatever. And we'll go from there. Stay classy. Thanks for watching in the first place, and have a great day.